Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series examining the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode number 31 for Sunday the 20th of May 2018, and today's episode is Supplementary 3, the TV series special. My name is Martin Darlington, and today I'm afraid it's just me, as Andrew is on vacation, but he'll be back shortly. What we're going to do today is look at some of the TV series that have been requested by listeners, especially Band of Brothers, one that comes up frequently, Rome, we're also going to cover Black Sails, Peaky Blinders and Turn. The ones that came close but didn't quite squeeze into this episode but may be covered in future episodes include Deadwood, which I really enjoyed, about the American frontier town, I, Claudius, seen by many as a absolutely classic series, Derek Jacobi playing the Emperor Claudius, and Vikings. Now, on the last title, I watched and really enjoyed the first two series of Vikings, the History Channel drama based around the life of legendary Viking raider Ragnar Lothbrok, but I kind of lost interest during the third series. It just seemed to lose its way. Now, friends I've spoken to who are still watching it say it does get it back, but I kind of stopped watching it. As far as covering it for HBH goes, I know far too little about the reality to be able to cover the series with any confidence without a tremendous amount of research. And this is really why we haven't done a History by Hollywood examination of TV series. So today's going to be a little bit of an overview. But for the Vikings, it's quite interesting. It was one I considered and I thought, I just don't know enough about them. However, I've recently discovered a fascinating podcast series that goes into the reality of Vikings, or Norsemen, as we should really call them. The History of Vikings is a podcast series by Noah Tetzner. It only started in late March of this year, so you can easily catch up. Nice short episodes, come out every few days, not like HBH, where we make you wait for a fortnight, then beat you over the head with a 90-minute episode. Noah's passion for the subject really comes through with some really great detail and perspective. He's very enthusiastic and clearly very knowledgeable. He has guests on. They talk about all sorts of different aspects of Norse life and an awful lot that, I didn't know. So I'll certainly be following his series, and next time we do a supplementary for TV shows, I do hope and expect to include Vikings. And who knows, maybe we'll be able to persuade Noah to come on board and give us a real expert's view. There will be a link to Noah's show in the show notes for this episode. There will be quite extensive show notes for this episode. So just go to the episode or homepage of historybyhollywood.com, scroll down to the blue links at the bottom, click on episode 31's link, and for the next 2 weeks that will be the top one, and you'll find them on that page, or you can just put TV special in the search bar. Right, some errata and updates. During the last episode, In the Heart of the Sea, we made frequent reference to Herman Melville's Moby Dick, seen by many as an American epic. What we didn't tell you is that the book didn't really capture many people's attention until well into the 20th century, long after Melville himself had died. During his lifetime, he sold more copies of his other books than Moby Dick, and I can't help feeling he would have died a frustrated man, his magnum opus having been savaged by critics as turgid, too long-winded, with unnecessary detail. These criticisms still exist today from some critics, but it did become an important milestone in America's literary culture and history. Also, another piece of errata, we outlined our upcoming shows last time out, but we got a couple of dates wrong. The Victorian Abdul episode will air on the 29th of July, and What's Love Got to Do with It, the Tina Turner biopic, will be on the 12th of August, so sorry about that. Also, talking about the Tina Turner biopic, I described Angela Bassett as having won an Oscar for her role as Miss Turner, when in fact, like Lawrence Fishburne, who plays Ike Turner, she was nominated but didn't win. She did, however, win a Golden Globe as Best Actress. Now, we've got a couple of new reviews. W.I. Appraiser from the USA wrote on the 3rd of May, I implore you to give this podcast a listen. I've learned so much about my favourite movies by listening, and it's such a practical way to learn history. 5 stars all day. And lots of exclamation marks. W.I. Appraiser, thank you very much indeed. It really, really does mean a lot. It encourages us, it spreads the word, it gets us ratings and moves us up on the iTunes lists. So really appreciate it. W.I. Appraiser, I'm assuming you're an appraiser from Wisconsin, although you could be an appraiser for the Women's Institute. I'm not sure if you have it under that name in America. Another review came in on the 14th of May, so only a few days ago, from History Dude 1492, also from the USA. I really enjoy this podcast and have honestly learned so much about all my favourite historical movies because of it. The hosts, Martin and Andrew, are very knowledgeable about history and their passion is contagious. I strongly recommend this podcast to any history lover out there. History Dude 1492, thank you very much indeed. Due to your name, I assume you have interest in Columbus, and we will be definitely covering 1492, the discovery, at some stage, hopefully in the fairly near future. And we're going to try and get Vincent Schilling back on, Native American journalist, and I know he's got an interesting alternative perspective on Columbus, what he achieved, what he did, and what he didn't do, and where myth and reality have diverged. And we've also got a welcome we'd like to send out to Scott Jeffrey, who's our latest follower on Twitter. You can find us on Twitter at History by Hwood. He's both a professor at Alberta University and a Toronto Maple Leafs fan. When I read Scott's bio and it said he's an associate dean at the Faculty of Ales, ALES, I just thought it was a student having a joke and saying he's a professor of beer, and then I found out that it's actually the Faculty of Agriculture, Life and Environmental Science, so I'm going to be quiet now. Not for long though. Scott wrote that he's well behind, having just finished episode 5, The Dam Busters, and he's keen to hear some later shows. There's some films he's really looking forward to hearing about, but he's trying to be patient and work his way through. So, if, when you hear this, Scott, drop us a tweet, and we know you've caught up to episode 31, and we'll be able to calculate your rate of listening on an hours per week basis, and then determine the addictiveness of the show, albeit with a sample group of 1. So by the end of Dam Busters, Scott will have listened to 4 hours and 43 minutes of the show, not including the intro episode. So as things stand, he has 35 hours and 52 minutes to get through before the start of this episode. Also, on the upcoming show front, we had a great suggestion from long-time listener, supporter and friend Gary Shavit. Gary's a listener who likes to do his homework. He likes to ensure he's watched or re-watched the movies we cover, Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals apart, and he commented that he has to rewind at the end of a show to the intro where we outline what's coming next. As we finally got around to actually listing a few shows ahead and making a proper plan, Gary asked if we could add an upcoming page on the website, so that's what we've done. This is subject to change if there is a pressing reason to change the order of the listings, but we will make every effort to stick to the published plan, and it should give you all a chance to track down and watch movies we're going to be covering. So thank you, Gary, and the page is live. It can be found at www.historybyhollywood.com/planned-episodes, or you can get it, the links at the top of every page will lead you to the other page. It's just called Planned Episodes. And we will, of course, continue to preview the next show or two as part of each episode's introduction. And to that end, looking forward, the next episode will be on Sunday the 3rd of June, when we'll be covering Saving Mr. Banks, the story of P.L. Travers, the author of Mary Poppins, and the prolonged attempt by Walt Disney to persuade her to allow him to make the movie of the book. I think we can all guess how that went. However, we want to find out how close to the truth they managed to make the movie. And with Emma Thompson and Tom Hanks in the lead roles, it's bound to be enjoyable and entertaining. After that, there will be our summer break, so the next episode after Saving Mr. Banks won't be until the 1st of July, when we'll be covering Mrs. Brown, with another strong lineup in the leading roles, with Judi Dench as Queen Victoria and Billy Connolly as John Brown. And now, on with the show. So, we'll start with Band of Brothers. You've just heard the hauntingly beautiful music that introduced each episode. It was a single series of 10 episodes, first aired in 2001. I cannot believe it was 17 years ago. And in total it runs for just under 10 hours. It was awarded a Golden Globe for Best Miniseries or Movie Made for TV, and far too many Emmy wins to list here. In I think a first for History by Hollywood, the Rotten Tomatoes rating is 100%. Author and historian Stephen Ambrose had met members of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, and a 1988 New Orleans reunion for the men who'd fought through Europe in World War II. He conducted interviews and persuaded former soldiers to agree to their recollections being made into a book. During the writing process, Ambrose would send suggested passages to various individuals to get their reactions and comments, so as he said, it was a constantly evolving process until they got to publication. He also consulted official unit records and diaries and proudly stated that the finished book was as close to the true story of Easy Company as is possible to get. He acknowledged in this cautious statement that no two people will remember the same incident or conversation exactly the same way. The book, Band of Brothers, was published in 1992, and in 2001 Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks got together and produced the miniseries, which was aired to fairly universal praise. Ambrose died in 2002, and although now he's most famous for his military books, especially that he followed the personal account style of Cornelius Ryan, who'd written the previous generation of World War II history books that relied on personal testimony as well as just official records. He has been accused, this is Stephen Ambrose, he has been accused by some historians of popularising history, and I do kind of think, is that a bad thing? You know, he makes it accessible, but it doesn't at all detract from his accuracy. However, he was originally best known as the biographer of former President and five-star General Dwight Eisenhower. In 2010, a story broke in The Guardian that Ambrose may have fabricated the depth of the relationship between him and Eisenhower, and even made up conversations, throwing the validity of the biographies into doubt. However, both the Band of Brothers book and the TV series remain hugely popular. One of the most compelling aspects of the series is at the start and end of each episode, unnamed actual veterans reinforce what we've just watched or we're about to watch in their own words, recalling the events and their comrades of the time. The clear emotion, both humour and sadness that's still so much part of their lives is tremendously moving. The 10-part series follows the progress of Easy Company from their basic training in Camp Toccoa, Georgia, under command of the strict disciplinarian Captain Sobel, who's played by Friends star David Schwimmer. Then they ship to England, where they do more training, and Lieutenant Dick Winters, played by English actor Damian Lewis, emerges as a major character as Sobel is reassigned before D-Day, much to the company's relief. Whilst he was likely to be out of his depth in combat, the company do realise eventually that Sobel's sweeping disciplinary methods have actually united them against him, whilst motivating them to give him no excuse to punish him. As Lieutenant Lewis Nixon, a friend of Lieutenant Winters, explains to him, he says Sobel's a genius. You know, not one man in this company would not run up a hill with a 50-pound pack on his back just to pee in his coffee. So they do sort of appreciate the effect he had, even though some of them continue to doubt that it was intentional. The next two episodes deal with a night jump into Normandy on D-Day and a battle at Carentan. Following this is an episode entitled Replacements, where we see new arrivals shipped in to replace dead or injured soldiers from the unit, and finding it very hard to be accepted from the veterans of D-Day. Operation Market Garden is covered in this episode, which was the 101st, 82nd American Airborne and British 1st Airborne Divisions attempting to cross the Rhine into Germany by capturing bridges at Nijmegen, Eindhoven, and of course at Arnhem, the infamous Bridge Too Far. The following two episodes deal with the build-up and deployment of the 101st to Bastogne in the Ardennes and the Battle of the Bulge, where a huge German counterattack nearly succeeded in splitting the Allied forces in two, and this took place in the depths of winter. As someone who served several years in Germany, their winters can be very, very cold. Following this is an episode entitled Breaking Point, covering the unit's actions around Foy in Belgium. Fighting continues and casualties mount as the command structure changes, Dick Winters having already taken command of Easy Company, now being promoted to take command of the regiment. The last patrol shows the soldiers' last major action of the war. The penultimate episode is then a harrowing one, both for Easy Company and for viewers of the series, as the soldiers discover a concentration camp in Germany. The confusion, disbelief and subsequent rage of the soldiers is very well portrayed, as is the blind denials of the local German population who claimed they knew absolutely nothing about this thing that was happening only a couple of miles outside their town. The final episode shows Easy Company liberating Hitler's Berchtesgaden retreat in the Alps, and then rounds off going through each of the main characters one by one and letting us know what became of them after the war. And at this stage, when we get the talking heads of the actual veterans who are being interviewed, we actually find out which one was which, and you realise that some of the actors were cast based on how much they looked like the real soldiers that they're portraying. And in the show notes, it's going to be a big show notes for this episode, we're going to include some photographs where you see the actor like Damian Lewis as Dick Winters in Band of Brothers series, and then the real Dick Winters next to him. So it'll be interesting by comparison if anybody wants to go into that much depth. The series has been largely acclaimed for its accuracy and depiction of the personal experiences of soldiers in war, as well as the historical accuracy of the events portrayed. The casting is interesting. There's quite a large number of British actors playing Americans. A lot of the series was shot in the UK. The accuracy of their accents can vary, but Damian Lewis, who plays Lieutenant, then Captain, then Major Richard Winters, probably the main character through the series, has been praised for the consistency of his accent. There are a few errors through the series, and there are websites dedicated to pointing out that they used the wrong type of rifle here, or the Tiger tank you see is actually a T-34 and such like. We're not too concerned with that sort of thing. Maybe the biggest error worthy of note was regarding Private Albert Blythe, who's played by British actor Mark Warren. He drops into Normandy on D-Day and is seen basically cowering in a ditch, and he suffers what was called then hysterical blindness. He recovers but remains an emotionally fragile character until he's hit in the neck by a German bullet, and the series implies that he doesn't recover, saying he died in 1948 from the wound. In actual fact, Blythe was hit in the shoulder. He did recover. He went on to win the Silver Star for gallantry. He then served in the Korean War, achieving the rank of Master Sergeant, and he actually died in 1967 from complications following surgery for an ulcer. It seems to be an honest mistake and not a dramatic device, but there is one particular scene where Private Blythe receives some advice from Lieutenant Ronald Spears, who sometime after D-Day was reassigned from Dog Company to Easy Company. Ronald Spears is played by Matthew Settle. He's a tough, no-nonsense officer viewed by soldiers with a mix of awe and fear. Spears tells Blythe that he's only struggling to cope because he still hopes to survive, and this is how he puts it.
What's your name, Trooper?
Blythe, sir. Albert Blythe.
You know why you hid in that ditch, Blythe?
I was scared.
We're all scared. You hid in that ditch because you think there's still hope. But Blythe, the only hope you have is to accept the fact that you're already dead. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you'll be able to function as a soldier's supposed to function. Without mercy, without compassion, without remorse. All war depends upon it.
So some chilling but probably pretty effective advice there. The series does show the humour, often dark, and the way that warfare can dehumanise some, but in others brings forth incredibly resilient humanity. Something that's been a rarely acknowledged thread through human history is how unusual it is to see hatred between opposing armies. They're sharing a common experience, and although they may want to survive and win the battle or the war, it's rare there's a personal element felt through a unit. Yeah, sure, a friend being killed or badly wounded may generate such feelings in a few individuals, but the shock shown amongst the Easy Company troops when Lieutenant Spears is suspected to have gunned down German POWs in the first days in Normandy is quite profound. And in a slightly chilling way, you wonder if this was true after the speech that Spears just gave to Private Blythe about acting as a soldier without remorse, without mercy. Regarding the shooting of the German POWs, several veterans have attested to this act, although not in the same circumstances as depicted in the series. Most of the Allied paratroop forces dropped the night before the invasion were actually instructed by senior officers to take no prisoners, as it would inhibit their ability to carry out their missions. Whether Spears did or not, he certainly don't think it was in a secure area behind their own lines with the beachhead established. The accounts I've read suggest that he was with another group of lost soldiers because there were misdrops all over the place from the paratroopers, both British and American, and that he was with this mixed band of soldiers. Some Germans surrendered to them, and they didn't even know where they were, so they couldn't take prisoners with them, and that supposedly is when he gave the order to shoot one group, and then he shot another group himself. He's also said to have executed a sergeant in his own platoon. Remember, this was on D-Day, and he served in dog company. This sergeant had twice refused an order under fire. Spears' account says that he started to reach for a rifle, the sergeant this was, so Spears shot him in the head. He did report this immediately to his commanding officer, but that officer was killed the next day and nothing further happened. So, Spears, definitely a war hero, may not have been a particularly nice guy, but he was certainly effective. I think another area needing further examination is that of Lieutenant and later Captain Sobel. We've got a clip here we're going to play, and this is an example of Captain Sobel's absolute tunnel-visioned approach to discipline, and this is him talking to Lieutenant Winters about an alleged misdemeanor.
No, sir, I do not understand. Your orders to me were to inspect the latrines at 1000 hours. From 0930 to 0955, I was censoring the enlisted men's mail by order of Colonel Strayer. At 1000 hours, I followed your orders to the minute.
I changed the time to 0945.
No one told me, sir.
I telephoned.
I'm quartered with a family that has no telephone.
And sent a runner.
No runner found me, Captain.
Irregardless, when given a task to perform by a ranking officer, you should have delegated your task of latrine inspection to another officer. You failed to do so. Were to let such a failure of duty by my own XO go unpunished, what kind of message is that to the men?
I performed my duty as I was ordered, sir.
And I disagree. So, your options are quite simple, Lieutenant. Punishment for your offenses will be denial of a 48-hour pass for 60 days. Stand before me at attention. Or you may initiate a letter of appeal and request a trial by court-martial. You spend your weekends on the base anyway, Dick. Be a man, take the punishment.
I request trial by court-martial.
So as we can see, Captain Sobel, even when Lieutenant Winters hadn't actually received the change in orders to inspect the latrines, he says, well, he still ought to be punished anyway. And Lieutenant Winters, quite within his own rights, takes the court-martial option. Needless to say, this doesn't go to court-martial, and this is probably one of the many incidents, together with some of the NCOs writing a letter to the CO asking to resign their stripes and return to the ranks, as they don't want to wish to serve in combat under Sobel, leads to Captain Sobel being reassigned to run a parachute school, much to his horror. And Lieutenant Winters is told, well, until we get another captain in, you take over Easy Company. The thing about Sobel, as we mentioned earlier, it's more the effect he had than the man himself. He did unite them. He did train them harder than any other company. Therefore, they were slightly fitter and certainly more motivated to not walk into one of Sobel's punishments. Our author Marcus Brotherton has done some research and says although Sobel was hated during the time, or at the time, and most of the men believed that if he led them into combat he'd get them killed, they much later would be split on their assessment of him. Some did still despise the man, but others said if it was only his relentless drive for improvement that kept him alive when they did enter combat, albeit without him by that time. His son, so one of Sobel's sons, attended an Easy Company family reunion and was greeted by several sons of veterans who said to him, "My father said to tell you, if I ever met you, that I'm only here and alive because of your father." Herbert Sobel would father 3 sons with his wife, but in 1970 he tried to commit suicide, shooting himself in the head. He survived, but he was blinded. He actually died in 1987, by then divorced, and none of his family attended his funeral. He was clearly an almost bullying disciplinarian, a great believer in collective punishment, where the whole company suffer for the misdemeanors of one man. I mean, this is generally banned, certainly in the British Army now, because it's seen as unfair. However, as a former Army recruit myself, and then I did a 3-year tour as a recruit instructor, I can attest to collective punishment being an incredibly effective way of teaching individuals that as a team, it's in everyone's interest they look out for each other. And don't forget, these men, or often little more than boys, were being prepared for combat in a very short space of time, going up against a very effective, disciplined and experienced army. It's hard to say. It's sad, I think, how Herbert Sobel's story turned out, but he definitely has his part to play. In the making of the series, 8 different directors would be used on the 10 episodes, including Tom Hanks himself for one. The only 2 who got to do more than one episode were David Frankel and Michael Salomon. And it's really quite impressive that the tone and the style of each episode certainly doesn't feel different. Anyone who's seen Saving Private Ryan will recognise some of the cinematography, but it is probably, well, it's definitely in the top 3 series I've ever watched. There's about 4 or 5 actually that are in the top 3. That's my maths for you. But it is just fantastic. And even if you're not someone who would normally want to go out of your way to watch a war film, it's the human interactions under incredible stress, and, as I say, this incredibly resilient humanity that comes through in so many of the men. It's just really, really impressive to see. Entertainment should be no surprise. I'm giving it 10. History, it gets 9. It really doesn't, in my opinion, get much better than this. Next up is HBO's Rome. Now, I say HBO's Rome, it was actually a collaboration between HBO, the BBC and Italy's Rai 2. They made 2 series, but we're going to concentrate on the first series here, simply because it's the one that has basically got more attention. And the second series, I didn't actually get to the end of it. Now, that's not to criticise, it was just life got in the way, the move out to Qatar, various other things during the time I was watching that. This series, the first series, first aired in 2005. It was written by John Milius, William J. McDonald and Bruno Heller. Rotten Tomatoes rated at 88%. Now, as any of you who use the Rotten Tomatoes to find out what audiences and critics think of a movie or a television series will know that pretty much anything above 75% is pretty good. Anything above 80 is really quite unusual, and I mean, for Band of Brothers to have 100% from thousands and thousands of reviewers is incredible. The scope of the first series of Rome covers the end of Julius Caesar's Gallic campaigns and concentrates on the civil war between Caesar and the Senate, led on the battlefield by Gnaeus Pompey. After Caesar's victory at Pharsalus, his chase of Pompey to Egypt and more adventures there, the action returns to Rome as Caesar consolidates his power, and it culminates in his murder at the hands of a gang of senators. There shouldn't be any spoilers here. Caesar is played by Kieran Hines very well, Pompey by Kenneth Cranham brilliantly, the hedonist Mark Antony by James Purefoy, but the 2 main characters through which we experience the story are actually a couple of common soldiers. There's Lucius Vorenus, played by Kevin McKidd, who, if anybody has seen the hilariously good kind of almost black humour werewolf movie Dog Soldiers, which I would say has the most realistic portrayal of the modern British soldier I've seen. Kevin McKidd is one of the sort of soldiers in that film. It's just a hoot. It's great. It's a little bit gory, but it is quite darkly funny. The other soldier we meet is Titus Pullo, played by Ray Stevenson, who we will actually meet again a little bit later in this same show. Kevin McKidd's character Lucius Vorenus is a centurion, and Titus Pullo is a hard-drinking, hard-fighting legionary who manages to get himself into trouble, but he's sort of got a heart of gold, so we forgive him a lot. Caesar is portrayed as politically astute, wily, yet humorous man, very at home amongst his troops, personally courageous and expectant of similar levels of courage and expertise amongst subordinate commanders. Lucius Vorenus wrestles with his conscience throughout the series. He's a dedicated soldier with a deep sense of duty, but he struggles with the entity to whom that duty is owed. Is it Caesar or Rome? Are they different? Vorenus also has a family back in Rome that, as the series starts, he hasn't seen for some time, possibly years. Titus Pullo is basically a pirate. He's, as we said, he's a big man. He likes to drink, have a fight, ready to use his fists as quickly as his wits, and he has various disciplinary run-ins with his superior Vorenus and other officers, but through their adventures a friendship and mutual reliance develops. The series also suggests that Pullo might have actually been the natural father of Caesarion, the boy that Caesar officially fathered with Cleopatra. We're not convinced that that's actually based on any kind of fact. Whilst the two main characters only have any historical veracity through their names, there are many nods to historical accuracy within the series. Just the general squabbles and power shifts that mark this period near the end of the Roman Republic are very well depicted, with both men and women conspiring, making and breaking pacts and alliances to get ahead in the game. The rivalry that culminated in gang warfare between Clodius and Milo is shown, for example, and people familiar with the era will know this was pretty much gangs in New York, but 2,000 years earlier in Rome. Just as in reality, it had effect on the political fortunes of both sides in the conflict. Polly Walker plays Atia of the Julii clan wonderfully well. She's quite a sexual and emotional manipulator. She kind of epitomises Machiavelli's prince in her ruthless pursuit of her family's interests. Now, she has two children, and the names are accurate: Octavia and Octavian, the latter being the young lad who would go on to become the Emperor Augustus. And Atia is desperate to keep him from the risky limelight as far as possible, but she also wants to use her children as pawns in her own political power struggles. Another character worthy of mention is, of course, Marcus Brutus, probably the most famous or infamous of Caesar's assassins, played by Tobias Menzies, who people may know as the incredibly evil British officer in Outlander, and a couple of other things I've seen of him that I can't bring to mind off the top of my head. The way he portrays Marcus Brutus seems to be quite accurate. He was torn between his duty to Rome and the patrician class who were his peers, or his personal loyalty to Caesar, who'd acted much like a surrogate father for most of Brutus's life. It has been suggested that Caesar may have been the natural father of Brutus, but he would have fathered him in his early teens, so it seems unlikely but not impossible. He did have a long-standing affair with Servilia, played by Lindsay Duncan, Brutus's mother, and that is historically accurate. When Caesar ended the affair, she is shown as becoming vengeful towards him, which is partly what leads her son Brutus to join the conspiracy to murder Caesar. The second series follows the initial alliance and then conflict between Marcus Antonius and the young Octavian, who's played by Max Perkis in his younger self, then Simon Woods in his older self. And for our astute listeners who will be fully aware that Octavian went on to become the first Roman emperor and was given the title Augustus, it will be no surprise that he wins the fight. The heroes of Series 1, Lucius Vorenus and Titus Pullo, continue to weave the narrative thread, and they show kind of down-to-earth, nitty-gritty Roman life as well. And as far as I can tell, as a very amateur historian, it's done fairly well. What life was like in Rome, the fact that it was an absolutely crazy, hectic, higgledy-piggledy city. It was built to no plan. It just evolved. And it's interesting. It's quite rare, I think. You know, Gladiator dealt with the emperor and the emperor's son and these generals. Yeah, we saw the gladiator side of life, but, you know, this is a bit more sort of down to earth. If anybody saw Deadwood, about the frontier town in the sort of mid to late 1800s, it's kind of similar to that, or Lonesome Dove. Great mini-series, unfortunately very, very loosely based on Goodnight and Darling, who drove cattle north in America, but great series with Robert Duvall and Tommy Lee Jones, fantastic actors. And I think you may remember from the Supplementary 1, the music and the movies, we featured some music from Lonesome Dove. Anyway, I digress, but it's kind of showing the grim reality of a life that's so often glamorized. So, Rome, how well did it do? Considering the ongoing fascination amongst most Western countries with Rome, and especially Julius Caesar, I find it quite remarkable how few major movies and TV series there have been about this period of history. These two series made significant efforts to portray the period as accurately as possible. There were lots of historical consultations and academic guidance on set. Caesar's legacy, continues to resonate amongst many countries of the world. I mean, it's been argued that only Jesus and Muhammad have had a greater influence on the modern world amongst historical figures. The Russian Tsar and the German Kaiser both bore titles adapted from his name. The principles of our upper and lower legislatures, which exist in most Western democracies, comes from Romans. And the principle of trial by jury and equality before the law is also a Roman concept. Whether Kieran Hines captures the charisma and undoubtedly extraordinary qualities of Caesar is a subjective matter, but he does show gravitas and humour. He certainly doesn't seem miscast, I wouldn't say. Both of these, the humour but also the consciousness of his own dignity comes through Caesar's own writings, as well as accounts that exist left by those who knew him. Even a political adversary like Marcus Cicero was complimentary about Caesar's qualities, whilst bemoaning that those qualities were being used for Caesar's benefit and not those of the Senate, who, if you remember back to episode 1, Gladiator, we did point out were a rich oligarchy who pretty much ran Rome for their own benefit. They weren't, servants of the people. Derek Jacobi, lovely chap. Senator Gracchus, completely fictional. Back to Rome, the two main characters, Lucius Vorenus and Titus Pullo, they're so named because Julius Caesar, in his commentaries on the Gallic War, very rarely names anybody but senior military or political figures. But he did mention these two centurions. They were both centurions in actual fact. They were attacked in their winter quarters by the Nervii tribe, and they were actually their legate. They were commanded by Quintus Cicero, Marcus Cicero's brother. He did very well, and they managed to fight off the Nervii, but the 11th Legion were the legion under attack, and Pullo and Vorenus were trying to outdo each other in acts of gallantry. Pullo attacks a group of a group of the enemy, but he's surrounded, and Vorenus comes to his rescue. In doing so, he gets carried away and chases some of these Gallic tribesmen off towards the woods. Then he slips and is quickly surrounded himself before Pullo returns and comes to his rescue, and they safely make it back to camp to the applause of their comrades. We don't know if any of this is true, but Caesar reported it. So these two names, they're pretty much the only two common soldiers. They're centurions, but they're more sergeant majors than officers. Pretty much the only two soldiers named by Caesar in either the Gallic War or the Civil War books. And yet we hear frequent stories of his ability to remember soldiers' names, even common legionaries, and the circumstances of some incident where they'd met before. And it's this sort of device that would gain such passionate loyalty from his troops, which were the real power base of Rome from pretty much the political generation before Caesar, with Gaius Marius and Cornelius Sulla, when they were going at each other, hammer and tongs. That's where the cult of personality kind of really developed in Rome, and troops started to become loyal to their general rather than to the state itself. In reality, in the Civil War, Pullo appears to have switched sides along with his cohort from Caesar's side to Pompey. What became of him at or after the Battle of Pharsalus is unknown, and of Vorenus he's never mentioned again after the incident in Gaul. As stated in the synopsis, the characters Clodius and Milo, Attia, she was Julius Caesar's niece in reality, making Octavian his great-nephew. But I'm actually not sure there is such a thing as a grand-nephew or great-nephew. Anyway, it made Julius Caesar Octavian's great-uncle. There we go. That works out. Yeah, they were all real people. Brutus and Servilia were all real people, and they're very well portrayed. James Purefoy is a wonderful character to watch playing the womanising hedonist Mark Antony. It does seem to reflect what's been passed down to us from history, although it should be noted that much of what we know about Marcus Antonius comes from the letters of Marcus Cicero, and he absolutely despised the man, so just be wary of your sources' prejudices. And Kenneth Branagh is worthy of mention as well. He plays a great role as Gnaeus Pompey. He even looks like the surviving busts of the Roman general. Kenneth Branagh does a marvellous job portraying what was by then a once great general who is aware, even if he won't admit it, even to himself possibly, but deep down he's aware his star is being eclipsed by the young, in inverted commas, upstart Julius Caesar. Pompey blusters in front of the Senate and says he's going to do this, that and the other. I can stamp my feet and legions will come out of the ground to support me. And the Senate are equally blind. Famously, that they do cover a bit of a scene where the night before the decisive battle, which of course they were doomed to lose, the senior senators were deciding who was going to live in Julius Caesar's house after they've executed him or killed him, and who was going to be governor of here and governor of there, and who'd have the plum jobs. The Greeks call that hubris, I think. So overall, I really enjoyed it. It's a period of history in which I'm fascinated. There were times I felt it just drifted away a little bit from what maybe its core focus should have been. It gets 88% on Rotten Tomatoes, we said. The second season gets 85%, so both very highly thought of. I gave it 7.5. We don't do halves, do we? No, I'm going to give it 7 for entertainment and 7 for history, simply because, a good 50% of it is detailing lives that we really know nothing about, that are probably quite plausible, but aren't necessarily actually, attested to historically at all. So 7 for entertainment, 7 for history. That sounds a bit bad. I actually really enjoyed it. If you're interested in Rome, it's worth a look. It certainly is. First series, I felt, was a bit more gripping than the second, but that's just my opinion. That stirring drumbeat theme music was, of course, the introduction music to Black Sails. This multiple series show ran from 2014 to 2017, and it charts the fortunes of a pirate enclave in Nassau on New Providence Island, north of the Caribbean, and its attempt there to become a pirate republic. The Rotten Tomatoes rating is 81%, so again, very, very good. And there are wonderfully rich characters throughout the episodes, portrayed with real gusto by an equally rich cast of actors. These characters largely fall into 2 categories: those who are real historical figures and those who are lifted from the pages of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. To that end, we have Captain Flint, played with great intensity by Toby Stephens, Long John Silver as a born survivor and self-centered pragmatist who, through the series, discovers both principles and eventually love. He's played by Luke Arnold. We have Billy Bones, played by Tom Hopper, and Israel Hands, all beloved characters from Treasure Island, alongside real figures such as Edward Teach, aka Blackbeard, although the series avoids his famous nom de guerre. This is played by Ray Stevenson. Hello again, Ray. We only just left you in Rome. Jack Rackham, played like a lovable pantomime villa by Toby Schmitz, and his sidekick Anne Bonny, a brilliantly violent female pirate played by Clara Paget, who must have had a ton of fun. We've got the menacing Charles Vane, played by Zach McGowan, and Governor Woods Rogers, played by Luke Roberts, all of whom were real characters from the so-called Golden Age of piracy. And of course Israel Hands, again, because he's the crossover. He was a real character who sailed with Edward Teach in reality and with Flint and Silver in Treasure Island. The ambition of setting up a proletarian republic is a theme that runs through the series and is a main driving force behind Captain Flint. Again, I'm not going to go into plot details, but it hits a marvellous balance between swashbuckling adventure and, great fight scenes and intrigue and some love interest, but there is real depth to it. Don't underestimate it, and there are some really powerful political messages which, when you first watch it, you may well think, well, this is for a modern audience. Well, let's hear it. This is Captain Flint talking to the, not self-appointed, but the unofficial queen of a runaway slave town that is set up on an isolated island. And these existed. They were often referred to as maroons, escaped slaves. And this is Flint trying to persuade her to join forces with the pirates.
Let's say that by some miracle we could dislodge the British from Nassau. I could not possibly hope to defend it with my numbers.
Your numbers? For every man in your camp, there are thousands somewhere in the West Indies living under the same yoke, chained in fields, pressed on ships, sold into indenture. When they see a sitting governor, protected by His Majesty's Navy, deposed by an alliance of pirates and slaves, how many consider joining that fight? How many thousands of men will flock to Nassau, join your ranks, and help you defend it? What does a colonial power do when the men whose toil powers it lay down their shovels, take up swords, and say no more? Bring down Nassau. Maybe bring it all down.
It's powerful stuff, and the violent Charles Vane, threatened with execution, makes a similarly sort of revolutionary statement. And we're just going to hear Charles Vane's statement, or his speech here.
These men who brought me here today do not fear me. They brought me here today because they fear you. Because they know that my voice, the voice that refuses to be enslaved, once lived in you, and may yet still. They brought me here today to show you death, and use it to frighten you into ignoring that voice. But know this, we are many, they are few. To fear death is a choice, and they can't hang us all.
This theme runs throughout the whole series, and it becomes increasingly a main theme. There are some purely made-up characters, and some of the show's leading lights fall into this category, notably Eleanor Guthrie, a character played by Hannah New, who attempts to set up a business empire by fencing pirated goods, and she shows an admirable knack for survival. Equally impressive is her sometime friend, sometime lover, and sometime rival and enemy, Max, played pretty exotically by Jessica Parker Kennedy. It is a great rollicking saga with some really interesting points to make about both modern society and that of the 17th century. The show tips its hat to history in both blatant and subtle ways, but overall it would score poorly on historical accuracy if being subjected to a regular HBH examination. I, for one, am happy to forgive that, as it's just so much fun whilst being gritty, and it feels realistic even if it's not historically purely accurate. It's brilliantly acted and produced. The reference is made to setting up a pirate republic on Nassau, and the benevolent attitude to former slaves and indentured labourers amongst pirates is founded in fact. Many pirates followed a code based around a meritocracy, not an autocracy, and there were real attempts to set up self-governing, independent havens. Governments of all nations could never allow that to happen, or Flint's remark about the men who labour to enrich those governments taking their labour away and bringing it all down could have proved very true, and the governments of the day were very conscious of that. So it'll be no surprise, and anyone who knows much about contemporary and recent history would know that none of these pirate havens became long-term successful. For anyone who really wants to know more about the period and to get frequent references to black sails, I highly recommend Matt Alber's Pirate History podcast, to which we'll put a link again in the show notes. Matt really knows his subject, gives a rich and detailed history of the true people and events of what we think of today as the golden age of piracy. Now, there is a lot of background and context and detail. Think Mike Duncan's Revolution series, but it is so enthralling, and you'll hear about pirates who most of us have never heard of. Blackbeard and Captain Kidd and Henry Morgan, yeah, most people will know about them. May not know the details, but they do know they existed. But I'm trying to think of one of the names that Matt's recently been talking about, the French pirates and the Dutch pirates. There are an incredible number of them, and it's a really, really entertaining podcast series to do. As far as marks go, entertainment, I give it 9. Absolutely loved it. I was so sorry when it ended, but it ended appropriately. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it actually wrapped itself up quite neatly. Historical accuracy, it's 3, really, just for getting some names correct. But Anne Bonny and Jack Rackham sailed together. She had another female companion, Mary Read. Obviously, Edward Teach, frequently known as Blackbeard, existed and was nowhere near as bloodthirsty as people believe. He was at times, but then his reputation, once established, meant that he very rarely had to actually do any fighting. As soon as a merchant ship realised that Blackbeard was about to catch them, they'd just hang up or drop their sails, drop their anchor and say, yeah, go on, take the cargo. And he'd generally leave them alone. He'd often even leave their ship, unless he actually coveted it. Anyway, Matt will tell you all about those if you want to go across to the Pirate History podcast. And as I say, follow the link in the show notes.
Past the square, past the bridge, past the mills, past the stacks. On a gathering storm comes a tall, handsome man in a dusty black coat with a red right hand.
So what you heard there was Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds and Red Right Hand, a song that was not written for Peaky Blinders because it was written in the early 90s, but kind of matches the mood incredibly well. Where do I start with Peaky Blinders? It's set in post-World War I Birmingham. That's UK's Birmingham, the UK's West Midlands. And the series follows the fortunes of the Shelby family. They're kind of, if not illegal, sort of slightly underground bookmakers, and the nucleus of a criminal gang known by the eponymous Peaky Blinders, based out of their local pub, the Garrison, which is set in Garrison Lane, Birmingham. Rotten Tomatoes rating gives it 96%, and it's just won Best Drama at the 2018 BAFTAs. The main character is Tommy Shelby, brilliantly played by our old friend Cillian Murphy. And I know I've been banging the Cillian Murphy drum quite a bit recently. If anyone is thinking, well, I've only really seen him in supporting roles, just watch Peaky Blinders. Cillian Murphy was in Dunkirk. Remember the comments we made about Tom Hardy, who also features playing an incredibly different role to that of a clean-cut Spitfire pilot. He plays a Jewish gang leader in Peaky Blinders. He's just as entertaining. But this thing about being able to act with a look, an expression which barely changes, Cillian Murphy's got it nailed. It features Sam Neill as Tommy Shelby's nemesis, Chester Campbell, in the form of a brutally dedicated Ulster-born policeman. The 4 series that have been on so far follow the ups and downs of the Shelbys against a backdrop of historical events, and has been hailed as the UK's equivalent to Boardwalk Empire or The Sopranos. Certainly, I found a lot of parallels to The Sopranos, which, along with Band of Brothers and Peaky Blinders, is in my top 3 best TV series I've ever seen. I did mention there's more than 3 in my top 3, because there's also Black Sails and obviously Game of Thrones, which I absolutely adore. But the thing about The Sopranos, and it's shared by Peaky Blinders, is the genius of writing and portraying a violent criminal, which Tommy Shelby is, just as Tony Soprano is, in a way that you will him to win. You like him. You feel that he's, someone you want to succeed. Now, there are 3 brothers. Well, there's actually more than 3 Shelby brothers, but the 3 main ones all served in the trenches in World War I together. There's Arthur, who's the eldest, then Tommy, and then the younger brother, John. Now, Arthur, as the eldest brother, feels he should be running the family business. Their father's, he's not dead, but he's not on the scene. And we actually find out that Tommy is the one with the brains, and he slowly takes over. And Arthur, he has some issues with that. The Empire expands, first taking on local rivals, then London-based gangs, forming alliances with other London-based gangs, and eventually it gets to the American Mafia become involved. Frequent reference is made to the main protagonist's experiences in the trenches, and the fact that they view their survival of that terrible conflict as so unlikely almost gives them a stoic approach to risk and the prospect of death. You weren't there is often used as a derogatory put-down to anyone who hadn't served in the trenches, but equally, anyone who has, even someone who they might consider as an enemy, it creates a bond between them, and you can see mutual respect and an acceptance of a shared experience. Tommy Shelby faces death in several episodes, and the calm acceptance with which he faces it is quite chilling. For anyone who hasn't seen it, I can't recommend it enough. For those who have, The Christmas Carol in the Bleak Midwinter will never quite be the same again. A fifth series is planned and should go to air in early 2019. Now, as we're being consistent, I really don't want to give away any plot spoilers because I'm not sure how successfully Peaky Blinders has crossed the Atlantic. It is available on Netflix, certainly in the UK. So to anyone in America who hasn't found Peaky Blinders crossing their radar, I seriously suggest you grab it, watch it, love it. It's fantastic. However, how true is it? Well, first of all, the title deserves some attention. The consensus was that Peaky Blinders got their name from the peaked caps they wore, the standard working class headwear of the era, and into the peaks of which they would sew razor blades, making the cap a weapon. We see this several times in the series, with caps being used to slash at opponents. However, a local historian and Daily Mail journalist, but don't necessarily hold that against him, Carl Chin, believes that the name comes from a less dramatic source. A blinder was someone who dressed snappily, and the word is still used as a superlative in the West Midlands for anything. Oh, that's blinding, or what a blinder. You know, he had a blinding game if he was a footballer, or the peaky bit is indeed the cap that they wore. So Carl Chin and several other social historians have looked at it and thought the peak cap's usefulness as a weapon has been quite questioned. Carl Chin himself believes the idea became fixed in popular culture after appearing in a novel called A Walk Down Summer Lane by John Douglas. Now, I'm not familiar with the book, but I would guess it's about Birmingham gangs. Now, there was a real Birmingham gang that went by this name, and on the show notes there will be a photograph of some of the real Peaky Blinders, but they were operated in the 1890s. They were quickly overrun and absorbed by a larger group called the Brummagem Boys, who were in turn taken over by the Birmingham Gang, a singularly unimaginative title. By the 1920s, when the TV series is set, I'm afraid the Peaky Blinders were just a memory, and even more afraid to say there was no real Tommy Shelby. There was, however, a real Billy Kimber. Now we're just going to hear a clip of Mr. Kimber as he appears in Peaky Blinders, where he doesn't sound very West Midlands, but he is the local horse race rigging guru, and he's a bit upset because he's found out that Tommy and the Shelbys have fixed one of his races.
And I'm the f***ing boss, okay? Right, end of parley. You fixed a race without my permission. You gypsy scum. What, live off the war pensions of these poor old Garrison Lane widows? That's your level. I am Billy Kimber. I run the races, and you fixed one of them, so I'm going to have you shot against a post.
Played by Charlie Creed Miles, Billy Kimber in the series is a bit of a pantomime villain of a character. He's slimy and arrogant, yet clearly outclassed and outwitted by Tommy Shelby. The real Billy Kimber, however, led the Birmingham gang and became the most powerful criminal leader in the country. He did serve in World War I, and he deserted. He was no coward. He was just a very keen proponent of self-preservation and self-advancement. I believe he was wounded on the Western Front. He was brought home for the convalescence, and he just skipped and didn't go back. He was said to have a magnetic personality, be highly intelligent, and also to be a willing and expert fighter. He was one of the first of the Birmingham gangs who forged an alliance with London gangs using the canal system to not so much smuggle but just move produce up and down between them, and he could be something of a blueprint for Tommy Shelby. As I say, it's just drama at its best. It's that real knack that The Sopranos pulled off, that several of these sort of series we've talked about pull off of. Yes, you've got the action and the drama, but you also have the drama of the relationships and balancing family life with all the family politics that go on. Your kid sister wants to marry a guy you think's unsuitable, you want to respect her wishes, and the sister, the Shelby sister in the series, is a very, very smart woman. There's a matriarch at the head called Polly, who is another fantastic character, just great to watch, but she has her vulnerabilities as well. Entertainment, it's a 9. It's a solid 9, bordering on a 10. Absolutely love it. History, unfortunately, just a 4, really. It's got some... It's based around a historical framework, but it's not much more accurate, really, than Black Sails. And I don't want to give away anything. I was planning to play a background of the carol in the Bleak Midwinter, as Tommy Shelby explains why this carol has significance for them. But I'm not going to do that, because unlike the movies, these series are things that a lot of people may not have committed to watching. Even if it takes you a couple of years to do it, it's so worth it, and it's really rewarding. So for Peaky Blinders, I'm afraid that's it after only about 10 minutes.
Do you want to tell them, or should I? This place is under new management. By order of the Peaky Blinders.
There's snakes in the garden, blood on the vines. Know there will come a day I can't wait anymore.
Okay, our final topic for today is Turn, Washington Spies. This is it was produced by the company AMC. It's based on Alexander Rose's book, Washington Spies, the story of America's first spy ring, and Alexander Rose was a consultant on set. This multiple series show depicts the evolution of Revolutionary War espionage and highlights the conflicts within communities and often within families between patriots and loyalists, in effect making it a civil war. Rotten Tomatoes rating is 77%. Personally, I think it deserved at least to get into the 80s. It's very good. It stars Jamie Bell playing Abraham Woodhull, a farmer living in Settercut, Long Island, who tries to remain out of the conflict, but through friends is drawn into involvement. Making things more difficult for Woodhull is Father Richard, played by Kevin McNally, is a local magistrate and staunch royalist. Plus we learn that Abraham's older brother had been killed early in the conflict while serving in the British forces. Benjamin Talmadge, played by Seth Numrich, sorry about that, Seth, is an officer in Washington's Continental Army, but he's also a childhood friend of Abraham Woodhull's, and he sees the opportunity to gather intelligence, sow disinformation amongst the British, and sets about arranging a spy ring, often without his superiors' knowledge or approval. What he forms, mainly using friends known to him from childhood in and around Settercut, becomes codenamed the Culper Ring. Anna Strong, played by Heather Lind, lives up to her name and becomes a vital link in the ring. Another Continental officer and former Settercut friend is Caleb Brewster, Daniel Henshaw, who, as a serving officer in the Continental Army, is obviously serving alongside Benjamin Talmadge, but he's also a wonderfully piratical character, using cover as a smuggler to disguise his true purpose. Ranged against the Culper Ring are the gently naive Settercut British garrison commander, Major Hewlett, played by Bern Gorman, the swashbuckling leader of irregular loyalist forces, Robert Rogers, played with some gusto by Angus McFadden, and he leads the famous or infamous Rogers Rangers. And there's also the chillingly evil lieutenant, later captain, John Simcoe, played by Samuel Rukin. There's something really creepy about him, because he's a big guy, he's very, very good at fighting, he's obviously enjoys killing and inflicting pain, yet he's got a really high effeminate voice, and we're just going to play a clip here. He takes over the Queen's Rangers, who are American troops raised to fight for the British, but in like light infantry role, or an irregular light infantry role. You'd think of them today as guerrillas. Okay, so here is the wonderful Samuel Rukin playing Captain John Graves Simcoe.
My name is Captain John Graves Simcoe, and I'm your new commander, by orders of Major John Andre. These are my orders, and yours are to obey mine. If you do, I promise to mold you into the finest light infantry in the land. Now, let's line up and fall in.
I think what they're saying, Captain, by not saying sod, is why should we obey a fop and silly togs?
I take it then that you already know all there is to know about fighting.
More than you, Dandelion.
Then kill me, if you can. You worry about the consequences, I see. But who would ever know all the way out here? You could kill me and then stop my body in some animal's burrow and say you never saw me. That is, of course, if you can kill me. My hope, of course, is that our lessons won't have to be repeated. Let's try this again. Fall in!
And what you heard there was a brutally edited, just to try and keep the clip short as possible, example of how Captain Simcoe maintains discipline amongst his men. On the British side, there's also the handsome and dashing Major John Andre, who's the British equivalent to Benjamin Talmadge, trying to form his own information network whilst developing counterintelligence against Washington's forces. The series introduces us to George Washington himself, played by Ian Khan, and played very, very well by Ian Khan, and the infamous Benedict Arnold, played by Owen Yeoman, who was a successful Continental Army officer who felt he was being passed over for promotion and recognition, despite being an accomplished battlefield commander, so he took his services to the Royalist forces, and in the process became a byword for traitors ever since. Another key character is Robert Townsend, played by Nick Westrake, a Quaker boarding house keeper in New York who reluctantly allows himself to be recruited by Woodhull to join the Culper Group. He proves invaluable as his bar is frequented by British officers who tend to be very loose in their talk. Right, it's a great series, it's really entertaining and it's quite informative, or it's very informative, but how much does it get right? Well, the series does play around with timelines somewhat, but pretty much all of the characters portrayed were real and largely in the roles that history has recorded. Robert Rogers was the leader of irregular forces in the British Army, although he was more Irish-American in ancestry than Scottish. The creepy Simcoe was also a real character who did search Settercut for the spy ring, suspecting of operating from there, but history advises us that he was a loud, aggressive and raucous soldier rather than the chillingly, quietly spoken psychopath that the series presents. Abraham Woodhull was real, and he was Samuel Culper by codename. Robert Townsend was equally real, and he was known as Culper Jr., and they both performed the roles portrayed, although their circumstances were slightly different to that we see. The portrayal of Woodhull's reluctance, and at one point Townsend's downright refusal to continue, is true, but they would eventually continue to provide the route for information to reach Washington's ears. Some changes have been made to their situations, though. For instance, Woodhull's father was actually a patriot by sympathy, far from being a royalist. Also, Abraham didn't marry until 1881, which was during his time as an agent of Washington. He didn't marry before, which is what's portrayed by the series. It's unclear if Washington himself ever knew the real identities of the ring, but Benjamin Talmadge was a real officer in his army who really did recruit old friends from his hometown and ran the ring with care and great success, whilst also forming a cavalry unit that did good work on the battlefield. Quite a character. Caleb Brewster was largely as portrayed, and Anna Strong was also real, although, unlike the series, there's no suggestion that she and Woodhull or the British officer Major Hewlett ever had anything beyond a friendship, and in the case of Woodhull, a collaboration for the purpose of gathering information. Now, there was also an Agent 355. Most of the Culper Ring had numbers to identify them to Washington's intelligence staff. She's almost certainly was female, but she's never been identified. Now, the series has Abigail, an ex-slave woman, as the agent, but this is fictional speculation. The series portrays Major John Andre, as mentioned, as the British counterpoint to Ben Talmadge, but in reality he appears to have been somewhat out of his depth in the fledgling world of espionage. Although he was the contact for Benedict Arnold to cross sides, Andre was captured, held, and his eventual fate is as depicted in the series, and I won't plot spoil with that one. But he does appear to have been slightly naive when it came to espionage. John Graves Simcoe did exist, and he really did lead the Queen's Rangers, specialist light troops recruited from loyal Americans. His troops led a night attack on a Patriot position, bayoneting over 20 men in their beds, which the Americans called a massacre, but was within the accepted norms of the 18th century warfare. The Queen's Rangers were pretty successful, and Simcoe ended the war a lieutenant colonel. He was captured but later released, and he went on to be the Governor General of Upper Canada, where he was largely credited with outlawing slavery within the province in 1793, nearly 40 years before Britain outlawed the practice across the empire. He was an officer respected by both his own men and the enemy, so some licence has been taken by the writers of Turn, but I can forgive them that, because in doing so they've created a wonderfully dark character that really is not quite the Sauron to Abraham Woodhull's Frodo, but it's not far off. The Culverin's greatest single achievement probably was revealing to Washington that a planned French attack was known to the British, who had laid an ambush. The attack was stopped in time, and had it gone ahead and a British ambush had actually worked, the French forces would have been hugely depleted and may even have persuaded France to pull out of the direct support of the Patriot forces. A number of American historians have said that without France they couldn't really have won, and that's one of those, wow, crossroads of history moments. Finally, it appears ludicrous to us in the modern era that less than 250 years ago there were otherwise competent military commanders who rejected the idea of intelligence as we understand it today. But it's true, spying was seen as dishonourable, sneaky, incompatible with the way that gentlemen conducted war. It reminds me of the French knights at Agincourt who despised archery as unmanly before being absolutely slaughtered and losing the battle. Or the Celts scorning the Romans for refusing to come out and join single combat just before the disciplined lines of the legions cut the Celtic warriors to ribbons. So, as Washington clearly understood, at the end of a war it's not who's right but who's left. In other words, wars need to be won as quickly as cheaply, both in terms of money and lives, as possible, and anything that allows that to happen should be welcomed. And I think that comes across very much so with Washington. His portrayal by Ian Khan is really something to watch. You won't see him prominently in every episode, but he's there enough to really enjoy a great performance, and he shows that kind of moral dilemma that a commander has. You want to do the right thing, both in terms of achieving victory, but also in terms of maintaining the moral high ground, and he is portrayed, and I don't know enough about George Washington to be able to say if this is correct or not, but he's portrayed as a decent man. And when he has to order someone to be executed by firing squad or a night attack to go in, knowing that he may well lose a lot of men, he does show himself in an emotional turmoil. Ben Talmadge is very well played as well, and Jamie Bell is very good as Abraham Woodhull, if not always likeable as a character, but then that's part of portraying, a character. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the conclusion of the 5 TV series we're covering in this supplementary. If you've enjoyed listening to me half as much as I've enjoyed talking to you, then I've enjoyed talking to you twice as much as you've enjoyed listening to me, and it's probably about the right proportion. Before I go, though, there's always something, and this is the curse of having got into this, and Andrew and I are both experiencing this in the way that we can't watch a film or a TV programme or listen to music in a film without analysing and thinking, ooh. And there's something that's really struck me, and it's really came out listening to Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Red Right Hand for Peaky Blinders. So let's just hear that clip again.
Past the square, past the bridge, past the mills, past the steps. On a gathering storm comes a tall, handsome man in a dusty black coat with a red right hand.
Now, it's a fantastic song. It's dark, it's minor key, it's got a gravelly voiced, enigmatic singer, and one of the comparisons we made from Peaky Blinders, or probably the main comparison, was to The Sopranos. So let's listen to Alabama 3 and a clip of Woke Up This Morning.
You woke up this morning, got yourself a gun. Your mama always said you'd be the chosen one. She said, 1 in a million, you got to burn the shine. You were born under a
Anyone notice a similarity? I mean, they're very similar styled TV series, dramas. The combination of family drama combined with the crime family. Now, slightly different, purely fictional, and more on the police side, but I really, really enjoyed the original series of True Detective with Michael McConaughey and Woody Harrelson. Now, the Hanson family sang the theme for that. Far From Any Road was the track. Let's just hear a clip of that.
She twines her spines up slowly towards the boiling sun, and when I touched her skin, my fingers ran with blood.
And who was it who decided, right, if you're going to make a sort of dark, multi-layered criminal drama which also has personal relationship aspects to it, you got to find a song with a deep gravelly male voice. It's got to be minor key. Now, okay, Far From Any Road has a female singer in it as well, but I don't know. And none of these were written specifically for the series. They were all existing songs that were chosen, but very good choosing. I would thoroughly recommend, if you've got an interest in the Vikings, listen to the History of Vikings podcast by Noah Tetzner. And for the piracy thing, I mean, Matt Olber's detail is just fantastic. It's fascinating. You want to know the origins of the cocktail mojito. It was a way of preventing sailors from getting scurvy. The origins of brandy, which apparently is concentrated wine. So the idea was you'd smuggle it from France to England, remix it with water, and therefore out of one barrel you could make 20 barrels of wine, and people tasted the brandy and went, no, don't put any water in this, I'll just have it straight, it's great. Anyway, that's Matt Olber's the Pirate History podcast. Links to both will be on the show notes, along with photographs of the Band of Brothers and the photographs of the real Peaky Blinders and a few other bits and pieces. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, and I look forward to rejoining you in a fortnight with Andrew again as we do Saving Mr. Banks.